Hello everyone. In this video we're going to be talking about the Edit tab of Davinci Resolve 14. I'll be explaining how to import a video both directly into the Edit tab, and we'll go back to the Media tab briefly in order to grab files as well. And we'll talk about moving clips onto the timeline, both the full clip and sections of the clip, and then making simple cuts between those clips. So quickly going back to the Media tab, the main advantage in the Media tab is that you have the folders and directories of your system kind of set up there on the left. You can, once again, of course, right-click and add new locations, but by default on Windows, it's going to give you your user/videos directory. And if you're like me, that's where you tend to put all your videos, because that's kind of how Windows was set up. So here I have 3 folders inside of that directory. So CC is Creative Commons, Captures, for videos I was recording, and then publish for when I have a video complete. You can really organize your folders for your system however you want. But here I'm going to go into CC because that's where I've downloaded a video, and credits into the description, of course, for this guy. We have a bike ride, a 2-hour or 1 hour 47-minute bike ride that we can mess around with a bit and go ahead and edit. So we can go here and drag this into the media pool, where it will show up on the Edit tab. And that would be fine. That's probably the way most people are going to do it. Another alternative is that you can find the files on your computer that you want to import just using Windows File Explorer or your operating system equivalent. Here I'm going to go into the CC directory, and we can actually just drag these files straight into Davinci Resolve. So I can pop it in here, or you can use the Media tab. It's really up to you how you want to do that. In this case, I'm just going to drop it into the media pool. Now, depending on your project settings, you may see this pop up, where it will say the clips have a different frame rate than the current project settings, which basically means that whatever defaults you have in your project differ from this file that we're importing. And if we click the change button here, we can have the settings in the project match the clip. So for instance, if your project was set up to be 30 FPS or frames per second, but your clip is 60 frames per second, you can click the change button and it will update the project settings. So I'm just going to click change there. And now this clip is going to be matched up against the project settings. Now, if you're curious about what those settings actually were, how many FPS this clip has, you can go into detail mode over here. And we can scroll through the different attributes that are assigned with this file. So we can see resolution 1280 by 720. Or in other words, 720p resolution, and the FPS is set to 29.970. Now, if you import multiple clips from different cameras and different sources, it's not going to be too big of a deal. When you actually go to deliver your project and publish it, you will have one FPS setting for the entire project. Probably what you want to do is make sure that your final output settings are at the highest FPS that your project would expect. So if you have one file that's 10 FPS, but another one that's 30 FPS with a lot of movement, you probably want your final project to output at 30 FPS. So anyway, moving on from that, we can just drag this clip into the timeline, and then we'd be able to cut it up and start editing from there. But that's a lot of footage to go through. So what we might actually want to do, depending on how you recorded your video, is you would find the portions that were important that you want to include in the final output, and then add only those portions in, so you have less to cut when you actually are working on the timeline. So when you're adding in clips to the timeline, you have this preview window here, and then the timeline preview window over here. So this is for importing clips on the left, and on the right is for what's actually on your timeline with the edits and everything else going on. Now, if you only see one of those, it might be because you have some of these options open up here at the top. Like you can see when I open metadata, that it decreases down to only one visible clip, so make sure those are all hidden. If I start hovering over the clip, you'll notice that there is a very thinly visible line, a lot of transparency there, where you can actually scrub to different parts of the clip before you even select it. So wherever you want to start from in the preview window, you just kind of position there, and then you can double click it, and that's going to be where the preview window gets stuck. So of course you can continue to select your location by hovering on the left in the media pool, but you can also just as easily navigate in the preview window by clicking at the position in your video that you want to grab from. Now, in order to bring in only a piece of your video, we would need to set what's called in and out points. So there's two ways we can do this. One is to use hotkeys, I, O on the keyboard, I to mark an in point, and then O to mark an out point. So what that's going to mean is I click I on my keyboard, and everything before the current location is going to be ignored. And when I scrub over here to the right and I grab basically where I want the end point to be, I hit O, and then everything beyond that O out point is going to be ignored. So when we actually drag this clip onto the timeline, only what's in between here is going to be shown. Over here on the right side of the preview window, for both the media pool preview window and the timeline preview window, you have mark in and mark out as buttons you can click on. So we can just go to a part of our video, hit mark in, another part, hit mark out, and we get the same results. It's just that you have to use the mouse instead of keyboard hotkeys. So when we have the clip that we want to import onto the timeline, we can either drag from the media pool and drop it here, or we can drag from the media pool preview window and drop it onto the timeline. You can see if you hover for a second, it's going to position it on the video track. Now, if you already have items on the video track, you can also import onto video 2 by hovering above video 1. Now, the reason you would want multiple video tracks is usually for things like titles and overlays. Whatever's on top is what's going to be shown. So if we have 2 video clips that take up the whole screen, whatever's on video 2 is going to be the one that shows. So to kind of demonstrate that, I'm going to grab a completely different clip here from the video. I'm going to drag it onto the video 2 track. And what we'll be able to do is go down here right where it's about to switch on to the video 2 track and play that second clip. And we can just hit play. And what you'll see is that whatever's on the video 2 track is going to be on top of video 1. So video 1's still there, but it's not playing at all. It's essentially irrelevant. So that's usually why you would only have titles and other overlay images on the video 2 or video 3 tracks. Now when it comes to audio, as long as your tracks aren't muted, which you can mute by clicking the mute buttons over here on the left, then all of your audio is going to be played back to your viewers. Now, one important feature I was talking about in my previous videos, which I think is really important in Davinci Resolve, is the ability to show audio waveforms, which are basically the peaks and the dips. And what audio waveforms are is as your clip progresses and different decibel levels in the audio appear, it's going to show you where it gets quiet and when it gets loud. Now, you currently can't see any of that because for one reason or another, it's currently disabled in this project. But if you want to change some of the settings and how things are showing in the timeline, there's a button over here to the left of the zoom in, zoom out feature where we'll say timeline view options. If we click on that, you not only have the ability to show audio waveforms, which we definitely want checked, but you can also disable or enable these video thumbnails you see in the clips. So if you want, you can turn it so that there's only going to be a starting and an end, and you can remove it entirely. Now, one of the reasons you might want to do that is it does take some processing power for your computer to generate all of these thumbnails, and depending on the strength of your machine, you might decide that having that there isn't worth it, or that you only need one thumbnail for each clip. One thumbnail at the start and one at the end. But for right now, all I really care about is showing those audio waveforms, so I'm going to check that. Now in this case, you can see them appear, but the video and audio tracks are really being condensed heavily right now. So what we can do is, if we want them to be larger so we can actually see what we're dealing with here, on the video audio tracks over on the left on the timeline, you can click on the border between them. So between A1 and A2, that's audio 1 and audio 2. I can left click and drag to increase the size of the audio 1 track, where we can see the waveforms a lot better. Now, ideally, you want some of these audio peaks to be rising closer to the top to know that you're basically having the audio at the right level. So what I'm going to do is there's this solid line here where we can left click on that and drag it up or down to increase or decrease the audio levels in the video. Now, the sweet spot you want it to be at is where it's loud enough so that you can hear stuff, but that all of these peaks, they don't actually go over the top of the audio, because that's when you would know it would get distorted. So if I go right here in this clip, and I'm going to mute track 2 for a second, just so that doesn't interfere with anything, and I open the audio mixer that's in the top right, you should see on A1 that when it hits this point in the clip, that the audio kind of peaks and gets pretty close to 0. Now, 0 is the bad spot for audio. You also notice that it will show red bars if it gets too close, because if it goes above 0 decibels, that's when audio is going to be distorted in your final video output. So I'm going to hit space here and we'll take a look at these audio levels. So you can kind of see it's peaking a little bit in some of these cases. So we actually probably want to tone it down a little bit. And what we might actually want to talk about later on in another video is how we can use a compressor to even out the audio levels on the entire video clip so that all of the video is loud enough to be heard, but none of it goes so loud that it breaks the 0 decibel limit. But for right now, just know that you can move this bar up and down to increase or decrease the audio on an entire clip for your project. It's really useful and probably the quickest way to increase your audio sound if its original recording was too quiet. So now let's move on to making basic cuts. The first 3 tools that you have in your timeline are selection mode, where you can select a clip. Going to be really useful if you want to delete it, because you can just select and hit delete on your keyboard. You can also hit Control-Z to undo that. Now with the selection tool, you can also change the starting and end point of your clips, which may change the length of it as well. So if we drag the clip to the left, we change when it starts or ends in the timeline. So what we can also do with the selection mode is to change the starting and end point for each clip, which will affect the total length in the timeline. And we can do that up to the total length of the original clip if we choose. So because this is a clip from a much larger file, what I can do is I can select the leftmost endpoint of that clip and drag it to the left. Basically, we're adding more length to the start of that clip, going backwards, as you can see. So we're adding on material that actually came before in the recorded file. Likewise, we can drag this to the right in order to decrease the length of the timeline clip by removing more raw footage from the clip. So you can do the same thing over here at the far end on the right out point. We can make it go on longer by left clicking and dragging it to the right, and do the same thing, or the opposite, by dragging it to the left, decreasing that clip until we get it to exactly where we want it. In order to better explain the next tool, Trim Edit Mode, we're first going to talk about Razor Edit Mode, which is the tool for actually making cuts in your video. So if you think of it like a real-life razor, you can select this with B, and you find part of your clip where you want to make a cut across it. So this can mean you select the tool, and then you go along on your clip, kind of taking a look at the preview window on the far right. And when you get to the right spot, you just left-click, and that's going to separate the one clip into 2 clips. Now, that's really useful because let's say that we didn't actually want everything to the right over here. So now that it's 2 separate clips, we can select the one on the right and hit delete on the keyboard. And now we have one shorter edited clip that is only showing what we actually wanted to. Now, the reason I wanted this clip to be much smaller so that we could actually see what's going on both sides of the clip, the difference between Trim Edit Mode and Selection Mode is that when you modify the starting and end points with Trim Edit Mode, you're not actually changing the length of the clip. So if I left click on the edge of this clip where it starts, you're changing where it starts and ends in the source material, but the length of the clip in the timeline is actually the same. So I'm going to left click here and drag to the right. So now that we have a much shorter clip in the video 2 track where we can see both the endpoints and the outpoints, we'll be able to better see what happens when you use the Trim Edit Mode tool. And there's actually multiple ways you can use this tool. As you kind of hover over your clip, you'll notice that there are different symbols that pop up depending on what location you're using. So by hovering above the thumbnail area in your clip, and left-clicking and dragging, you change the start and end points of those clips without actually changing the duration in the timeline. So if you decide that you want something to be an exact length, but you're not exactly sure when you want it to start and end, this can be a useful tool. You'll drag until you're happy with where it's starting and where it's ending. Then you simply let go, and now the actual content of the clip has changed without changing how long the duration is. If you hover below the thumbnail, where you get these square brackets, then what's going to happen is you actually move the clip when you left-click and drag it. If you hover over the right side of the left, and you press left-click and you start dragging, it's going to add or remove footage to the clip, but instead of changing the starting point, it's going to be changing the total length of the clip while the starting point remains in place. So what actually ends up changing is the end point. But if you left click and hold from the left side of the end point and drag, it's actually just going to move the clip on the timeline, similar to how you would with this double brackets. If you hover right on the border of the left hand side or the right hand side, you left click and you drag, it's actually going to change the total duration of the clip, but also changing the starting point of the clip, just like if you were using the selection tool. If you have the trim edit mode selected, but you click on the right side of the clip, regardless of if you click on the border or you click on the left-hand side, it's going to have the same functionality where you're increasing the length of the clip while changing the end position of your clip. So let's show that by clicking on the border as well. Same functionality there. It basically just changes when the clip ends, and by doing that, it increases the length of the clip or decreases it. The last thing we'll talk about in this video is to do ripple deletes when you remove part of your clips and you want everything on the right side to move over to the left so that your clips stay bumped up next to each other and you don't get any black space in your video. That would be when we need to use a ripple delete. So I'm going to make some cuts with the razor edit mode. We'll just kind of randomly choose here and here. And we'll say that we don't want this clip. Now, if we hit delete on the keyboard, the default functionality is actually going to be to use a ripple delete. So you can see that the clips to the right automatically move over to the left so that the time gap that we would have just created by removing this outright without adjusting the positions on the right doesn't exist. So these two clips to the left of this one we delete are side by side with each other seamlessly, as if this clip never existed in any way whatsoever. But if you aren't using delete on your keyboard, we would right-click the clip, and you have cut, ripple cut, delete selected, and ripple delete. Now, I've already shown you early on in the video how to make a simple cut by using the razor edit mode, selecting two clips, then using the selection tool, or just dragging a box around the clip to get it selected, and hitting delete on your keyboard. That does what's called a ripple delete, which is usually what you want because you don't want there to be this black space between your clips where there's nothing happening, no audio, no anything. In a final video product, you don't usually want that. But there's other types of cuts you can make. So if I use the razor edit mode and I make another cut here, and we're going to say we want to remove this clip, but there's other ways we can remove it. And the easiest way to see that would be to right click it, and then we can see a big list of options here in this drop-down menu. The four that really stand out here relating to making cuts in your video are a classic cut, a ripple cut, delete selected, and ripple delete. The difference between cut and delete is when you cut a video file, the same way if you're working in a program like Microsoft Paint and you cut something, it actually stays in your computer's memory buffer temporarily, which means that you can paste it somewhere else if you choose so. So if I do a cut here, what's going to happen is it leaves that black space I was talking about. So it's not rippling over these other clips, but the clip still exists in the memory buffer. So by positioning on the timeline where I might want to paste it in, I can do a Control V to paste that same clip we cut out onto the timeline, or we can right click and do a paste or paste insert. Now the difference between paste and paste insert is that paste will overwrite any video footage inside of the track that we pasted into, but paste insert will push everything in front of it to the right. So I'll show you what I mean. Paste actually just overrides everything that would be in its way, whereas paste insert pushes everything in front of it to the right. So since a cut puts the clip in the memory buffer, that means that delete is just going to remove it outright. So if let's actually do a much larger clip to show that it in fact does not go in the memory buffer. So I'm going to delete this clip here, and right before we do, I'm going to hit Control-V to paste what's already in the memory buffer. You can see that's much shorter. But if I select this, I right-click and I do a ripple delete, and now I select this and do a delete selected, and I do a Control-V to paste what's already in memory. You can see that the deleted clip did not copy into the memory. And then finally, just like when you hit delete on your keyboard, ripple delete is an option here in this right-hand click menu. As you can see, of course, there are hotkeys you can learn for doing these different functions like cut and ripple delete. I'm just going to ripple delete that, and everything to the right is going to be pushed over to the left for the same amount of time where that deleted clip took up. So if it was a 20-second clip we deleted, then everything in front of it is going to be pushed 20 seconds to the left. Now you can see if there was already a gap between our clips, that's still going to remain there. And if you have one of these gaps, you can actually delete the gap too with a ripple delete by right-clicking on the gap in the video track and going to ripple delete, which is going to make these two clips, once again, tie right into each other with no black space in your final video. So I want to wrap this video up on the Edit tab. There's still more to talk about, such as adding special effects and transitions. But since this video is already going really long, we're going to make that the next video in this series. So I hope you learned quite a bit about importing files and doing basic edits and cuts inside of the Edit tab for Davinci Resolve 14. I've been Chris, and I will see you guys in my future video content.